They laughed when they dumped the broken, paralyzed mountain man on the young widow's porch, calling him a husband. It was meant to be a cruel joke to break her spirit and steal her land. But the town of Oak Haven was about to learn a terrifying lesson about resilience. The summer of 1882 hit the Montana Territory like a blacksmith's hammer. In the dusty, unforgiving settlement of Oak Haven, survival was a daily wage earned in sweat and blood. For 26-year-old Leora Higgins, that wage had just become impossibly steep. It had been exactly 3 weeks since a sudden, brutal bout of cholera had taken her husband, Elias, leaving her entirely alone on the Double H Ranch. Elias had been a good man, but a poor gambler, and he had died leaving Leora with a mountain of debt held by the town's most ruthless patriarch, Mayor Josiah Caldwell. Josiah was a man who smelled of imported cigars and avarice. He and his arrogant, heavy-handed son, Beauregard, had been eyeing the Double H for years. The ranch sat on a coveted stretch of land that possessed the only year-round deep-water spring in the valley. With Elias gone, the Caldwells smelled blood in the water. They assumed Leora would pack up her meager belongings, forfeit the deed to settle the debts, and retreat back east. They gravely underestimated the iron in Leora's spine. Determined to keep her home, Leora rode into Oak Haven on the sweltering afternoon of the annual Founders' Day auction, leading her last 2 healthy draft horses to sell. The town square was a chaotic mix of livestock, braying mules, and rowdy ranchers drinking tepid beer from wooden barrels. Mayor Caldwell stood on the auctioneer's block, a smug, satisfied grin splitting his weathered face as he watched Leora approach. "Well, if it isn't the grieving widow Higgins," Josiah boomed, his voice carrying over the din of the crowd. The chatter died down. The townspeople, folks like Emmett Miller, the blacksmith, and Abigail Preston, the seamstress, turned to watch the spectacle. They pitied Leora, but no one dared cross the Caldwells. "I've come to sell my team, Mayor," Leora said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "To make my monthly payment," Josiah chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "A noble effort, Leora, but a few $100s won't cover what Elias owed me. And a woman alone out on the frontier. It's a tragedy waiting to happen. You need a man to run that place. In fact, out of the goodness of my heart, I've decided to forgive a portion of your debt today by providing you with a husband." The crowd erupted into confused murmurs. Beauregard Caldwell stepped out from the shadows of the livery stable, leading a flatbed freight wagon drawn by a single sway-backed mule. On the back of the wagon, bound by heavy hemp ropes to a makeshift wooden chair, was a titan of a man. He was easily 6'5", broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, with a thick, untamed beard and hair the color of raw iron. But his massive frame was slumped, defeated. His legs, clad in dusty, frayed canvas trousers, hung limp and useless at his sides. This was Eric Montgomery, a legendary trapper and mountain man from the high peaks of the Bitterroot Range. 3 months prior, Eric had been crushed beneath a massive falling pine during a freak logging accident, snapping his spine and paralyzing him from the waist down. The railroad company had dumped him in Oak Haven with a handful of silver dollars, which had run out weeks ago. He had been living in the alley behind the saloon, a starving, broken, giant. Here he is, Josiah mocked, gesturing grandly to Eric. The finest specimen of frontier masculinity. I bought his medical debts this morning. He's yours, Leora, a strong, capable man to help you plow your fields. The crowd erupted into cruel, raucous laughter. Beauregard slapped his knee, tears of mirth streaming down his face. It was the ultimate insult, a calculated public humiliation designed to break Leora entirely. They were giving a cripple to a penniless widow, expecting the impossible burden to finally force her off the land. Eric slowly lifted his head, his eyes, a piercing, stormy grey, locked onto Leora's. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound, suffocating shame. He looked like a wolf caught in a steel trap, waiting for the final blow. Leora stood frozen in the dust. She looked at the laughing faces of the townspeople, at the sneering Caldwells, and finally, at the broken mountain man on the wagon. The cruelty of it made her stomach turn, but a sudden, blazing fire ignited in her chest. She saw the way Eric's massive, calloused hands gripped the armrests of his wooden chair, knuckles white, forearms corded with thick veins. His legs were gone, but the man was not dead. Leora walked slowly toward the wagon. The laughter began to die down as the crowd realized she wasn't crying. She wasn't running away. She stopped at the edge of the flatbed, looking directly into Eric Montgomery's eyes. "Can you swing an axe, Mr. Montgomery?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Eric blinked, startled by the steady respect in her tone. He swallowed hard, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "If I got something to lean on, ma'am, I can split the devil himself in half." Leora nodded once. She turned back to the stunned mayor. "I accept your terms, Josiah. The debt is reduced, and I am taking this man and this wagon. And if any of you ever step foot on the Double H without an invitation, you'll find out exactly what kind of tragedies happen on the frontier." She climbed onto the driver's bench, took the reins of the mule, and drove the broken mountain man out of Oakhaven, leaving the Caldwells staring after her in absolute, baffled silence. The journey back to the Double H was long, agonizing, and completely silent. Leora could hear the rough, ragged breathing of Eric behind her as the wagon hit every rut in the dirt road, jostling his paralyzed lower half. She knew the pain must be excruciating, but he never made a sound. When they finally arrived at the modest, whitewashed farmhouse as dusk settled over the plains, the reality of their situation set in. Getting a 250-pound paralyzed man out of a wagon and into a house was a Herculean task. Leora brought out a sturdy wooden ramp Elias had used for moving heavy feed barrels. With Eric using his massive arms to drag himself backward and Leora straining with every ounce of her strength to support his hips, they managed to get him onto the porch and into the front parlor. By the time they finished, both were soaked in sweat. Eric collapsed onto the small, chintz-covered sofa, his chest heaving. The sheer humiliation of needing a woman to haul him like a sack of grain washed over his face. He covered his eyes with a forearm thicker than Leora's thigh. "You should have left me in the dirt, Mrs. Higgins," Eric rasped into the quiet room. "Caldwell played you for a fool. I'm dead weight. I can't walk. I can't run. I can't even stand to piss like a man. I'm just going to eat your food and slow you down." Leora walked to the kitchen, pumped cold water from the indoor hand pump into a basin and brought it to him along with a clean towel. "Mr. Montgomery," Leora said firmly, handing him the towel, "I did not bring you into my home to dig another grave. I've had enough of death. You have a working brain, a pair of eyes, and shoulders that look like they belong on an ox. If you think you're going to sit on my sofa and feel sorry for yourself while I pull weeds, you are sorely mistaken." Eric lowered his arm, staring at her in genuine shock. No one had spoken to him with anything but pity or disgust for 3 months. Leora's sheer pragmatic audacity struck a chord deep within him. He took the wet towel and wiped the grime from his face. A slow, almost imperceptible nod forming. "All right, widow. What's the first chore?" The next few weeks were a brutal, frustrating period of adaptation. Leora possessed a sharp, mechanical mind, a trait she had hidden while her husband was alive. She dismantled the heavy wooden chair Eric had been tied to and salvaged a set of large, iron-rimmed wheels from a broken-down prairie schooner out in the barn. Using heavy carriage bolts, leather straps, and an old buggy seat, she engineered a custom, reinforced wheelchair designed specifically for the rough terrain of the ranch. It was wide, heavy, and practically indestructible. When Leora presented it to him, Eric gripped the iron wheels, testing the weight. He pushed forward, and the chair glided smoothly across the hardwood floor. For the first time since the tree had crushed him, a spark of true life returned to his stormy grey eyes. "Thank you, Leora," he whispered quietly. From that day on, the dynamic of the Double H shifted. Eric could not plough the fields or wrangle the remaining cattle, but he possessed a mountain man's ingenuity. He positioned his chair at the heavy wooden workbench in the barn. With his immense upper body strength, which only seemed to grow as his arms compensated for his legs, he became the ranch's unyielding engine. He repaired broken harnesses with flawless, intricate leatherwork. He sharpened axes and scythes until they could slice through paper. Leora brought him logs, and using a modified, short-handled splitting maul he forged himself, Eric reduced giant stumps to perfect firewood with terrifying rhythmic precision. He fixed the broken windmill by hoisting himself up a pulley system he designed, hanging suspended 50 feet in the air by a thick rope while he ratcheted the gears back into place. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching the purple Montana sunsets. Eric would carve beautiful, intricate figurines out of cottonwood bark, telling Leora stories of the high peaks, of tracking grizzlies through deep snow, of the northern lights dancing over frozen lakes. In return, Leora told him about her dreams of turning the Double H into the finest cattle operation in the territory, free from the shadow of men like the Caldwells. A profound, quiet intimacy grew between them. Eric realized Leora never looked at his useless legs. She only ever looked him directly in the eye. Leora realized that beneath Eric's gruff, hardened exterior was a man of fierce loyalty, deep intellect, and gentle protection. The town's cruel joke had inadvertently given her the one thing she desperately needed: a true partner. But down in the valley, Josiah and Beauregard Caldwell were watching the smoke rise from the chimney of the Double H, and their patience was running out. By the time the first hard frosts of autumn painted the Montana plains in brittle hues of silver and dead gold, the Double H Ranch was not just surviving. It was aggressively coming back to life. Leora, unburdened by the constant, grinding need to repair equipment and chop wood, had been able to focus her sharp mind entirely on the harvest and the herd. She spent her days in the saddle of her roan mare, driving the cattle toward the richer grazing grasses near the foothills, while the rhythmic, metallic ring of Eric's hammer echoed constantly from the barn. Leora had taken a calculated risk. Bypassing the Oakhaven market entirely, she negotiated a quiet, off-the-books sale of her prime winter wheat with a traveling mercantile agent named Jeremiah Cobb. The transaction took place at the crossroads 3 miles from town, securing her a leather pouch thick with greenbacks, enough cash to easily make her next 2 payments to the Oakhaven Bank, with enough left over to stockpile winter provisions. But secrets on the frontier were like water in a sieve. Word of the widow's sudden prosperity and the mysterious crippled giant who manned her barn eventually trickled down to the sawdust-covered floorboards of the saloon in Oakhaven. It happened when Emmett Miller, the town blacksmith, rode out to the Double H to deliver a heavy load of raw iron stock. Emmett had expected to find a ruined homestead. Instead, he found Eric Montgomery. Emmett stood frozen in the doorway of the barn, watching in absolute awe as the paralyzed mountain man, strapped into his reinforced wheelchair, heated a thick, half-inch steel wagon axle over a roaring forge. With tongs in one hand and a heavy crosspeen hammer in the other, Eric brought the hammer down with a terrifying, explosive force that shook the rafters. His shoulders and arms, compensating for his useless legs, had swollen to the size of seasoned oak logs. Without flinching, Eric gripped the glowing steel with his bare, leather-gloved hands and bent the iron into a perfect U-shape, using only the raw, terrifying torque of his upper body. Emmett rode back to town wide-eyed and immediately ordered a double whiskey. He told everyone who would listen about the bearded gargoyle at the Double H, who could snap a man in half from a seated position. In his opulent, velvet-draped office above the bank, Mayor Josiah Caldwell listened to the rumors, his face purple with rage. The deed to the Double H and its priceless deep-water spring was slipping through his fingers. He summoned his son, Beauregard, pouring a heavy glass of amber bourbon with shaking hands. "I am a laughing-stock, Beau," Josiah hissed, slamming his glass down on the mahogany desk. "I gave her a half-dead beggar to break her spirit. It was a joke, and instead she's turning a profit. That land is ours by right of frontier capital. I want her gone before the first snow sets in. I don't care how you do it, but I want that widow off my land. And I want that cripple put out of his misery." Beauregard, desperate to prove himself to his overbearing father and harboring a deep, venomous resentment for Leora's public defiance at the auction, gathered 3 of his most ruthless, low-morals ranch hands. Over a bottle of cheap gin, they concocted a cowardly, lethal plan. They would ride out to the Double H under the cover of a moonless, freezing Tuesday night. They would poison the deep-water spring with a sack of arsenic, and then they would burn the main barn to the ground. Without water or winter shelter for the animals, Leora would be financially ruined and forced to flee in a matter of days. The night they chose was pitch black, the air biting and utterly still, carrying the heavy scent of impending snow. Eric was awake in his small room near the back of the farmhouse. Though his lower half was entirely numb, his mountain-honed senses remained razor-sharp, attuned to the wilderness. He lived his life listening to the wind, reading the subtle, invisible changes in the environment. Around 2 in the morning, his eyes snapped open. He heard it, the faint, muffled crunch of hooves on frost-hardened grass, deliberately bypassing the main gravel road. Eric didn't wake Leora. He slipped silently from his bed, using his arms to swing his heavy torso into his custom wheelchair. He moved with a practiced, ghostly silence. He had been greasing the iron wheels of his chair daily specifically for stealth. He strapped a heavy leather bandolier across his massive chest, holstered his massive .44 caliber Colt Walker revolver, and grabbed a coiled 50-foot length of braided rawhide lasso from the wall peg. Rolling out the back door, he navigated the dark, freezing yard, positioning himself deep in the impenetrable shadows of the hayloft overhang. He waited, his breathing slow and shallow. 4 dark figures dismounted near the tree line. One man broke off, carrying a large, sloshing burlap sack toward the crystal-clear spring. Beauregard and the other 2 crept toward the barn, the glass slosh of kerosene and the scratch of a matchbox audible in the dead silence. They thought they were hunting a helpless widow and a broken cripple. They didn't realize they had just stepped into the hunting grounds of an apex predator. Eric didn't yell. He didn't fire a warning shot. He waited with the patience of a trapdoor spider until the man with the sack of arsenic knelt by the rocky edge of the spring. With a flick of his massive, powerful wrist, Eric sent the lasso whistling through the freezing air. The braided rawhide loop dropped perfectly over the man's shoulders, pinning his arms tight to his ribs. With a brutal, singular heave of his monstrous upper body, Eric yanked the rope backward. The hired gun was violently jerked off his feet, flying backward through the dirt and crashing heavily against the solid wooden base of the water trough. He was knocked instantly unconscious, the arsenic sack spilling harmlessly onto the frozen dirt, inches from the water. The heavy thud alerted Beauregard and the other 2 men. They spun around, dropping the kerosene tin in panic, drawing their 6-shooters. "Who's there?" Beauregard shouted, his voice cracking with undeniable fear, echoing off the canyon walls. From the pitch-black shadows of the barn overhang, a deep, resonant voice echoed, sounding like boulders grinding against each other in an avalanche. "You boys are a long way from the saloon." One of the terrified hired hands fired blindly into the darkness. The bright flash of the muzzle illuminated Eric for a split second. A terrifying, bearded titan strapped to a chariot of iron and wood, his eyes reflecting the pale starlight. Before the hired hand could even thumb his hammer back again, Eric drew his Colt Walker and fired twice. Boom, boom. The massive slugs didn't hit the men. Instead, they flawlessly severed the heavy, load-bearing wooden support beam directly above them. A shower of heavy timber, rusted iron pitchforks, and 50 pounds of hay rained down, burying the 2 hired hands under a mountain of debris. They screamed, pinned to the frozen ground and utterly terrified. Beauregard was the only one left standing. Raw panic consumed him. He turned to sprint toward his horse, but Eric had already propelled his chair forward with frightening mechanical speed. The heavy wheels crushed the frost as Eric intercepted the younger Caldwell. Eric launched his upper body out of the chair like a striking grizzly bear. His massive, calloused hand clamped around Beauregard's throat, dragging both of them violently to the freezing dirt. Beauregard gagged, dropping his gun, clawing uselessly at the tree trunk-like arm pinning his windpipe. Eric leaned in close, his grey eyes blazing with a terrifying, ancient fury. The smell of gun smoke and cold iron hung between them. "You tell your daddy," Eric whispered, his breath steaming in the frigid air, "that if he or his dogs ever look in the direction of this ranch again, I won't just break their legs. I'll pull their spines out through their throats. Do we have an understanding, boy?" Beauregard, weeping openly and choking for air, nodded frantically. Suddenly, the front porch of the farmhouse lit up with the glow of a kerosene lamp. Leora stood there in her white cotton nightgown, a heavy buffalo hide coat thrown over her shoulders. She was leveling a Winchester repeating rifle at the yard, her stance wide and perfectly balanced. She took in the chaotic scene, the unconscious man by the spring, the two men trapped and whimpering under the timber, and Eric, the paralyzed man the town had mocked, holding the heir to the Caldwell fortune down in the dirt with a single hand. Leora didn't scream. She didn't panic or ask what was happening. She simply cocked the lever of the Winchester, the mechanical clack-clack echoing loudly like a judge's gavel in the quiet night. "Mr. Montgomery," Leora called out, her voice calm, authoritative, and utterly devoid of fear. "Do we need to dig holes tonight? Or are they leaving?" Eric shoved Beauregard away in utter disgust, hauling his massive frame back up into his wheelchair with a single, powerful push of his arms. He looked at Leora, a profound smirk hiding beneath his thick beard. "They were just leaving, Mom." The brutal winter of 1882 descended upon the Montana Territory not with a whisper, but with the screaming howl of a timber wolf. The locals would later call it the Great White Death. Temperatures plummeted so rapidly that the deep water spring on the Double H Ranch, the very prize the Caldwells coveted, grew a thick crust of ice around its edges, though its center remained defiantly flowing. In the town of Oak Haven, the humiliation of Beauregard Caldwell was a heavily guarded secret, but secrets on the frontier had a way of bleeding out into the dirt. Josiah Caldwell was a man possessed. The fact that a penniless widow and a crippled mountain man had bested his son and his finest hired guns was a poison festering in his veins. Since direct violence had failed so spectacularly, Josiah turned to the weapon he wielded best: economic strangulation. He leveraged his power as mayor and primary bank shareholder to cut off the Double H entirely. When Leora rode into town in late November to purchase winter provisions, flour, salted pork, coffee and kerosene, she found the doors of Pendleton's Mercantile barred to her. Thomas Pendleton, the town assayer and store owner, stood behind the glass, refusing to meet her gaze. The blacksmith, Emmett Miller, was ordered under threat of foreclosure to stop selling Eric any iron or tools. Josiah intended to starve them out, freeze them out, and wait for the spring thaw to collect the corpses and the deed. He fundamentally misunderstood the pair he was hunting. Eric Montgomery had survived winters in the Bitterroot Range with nothing but a hunting knife and a buffalo hide. To him, the cold was an old, familiar enemy. While Josiah plotted in his heated office, Eric transformed the Double H into a fortress. Using the last of the scrap iron he had salvaged, Eric reinforced the farmhouse doors with heavy wrought iron bands and drop bars. He boarded up the lower halves of the windows, leaving narrow firing slits. In the barn, he constructed a masterpiece of frontier engineering, a heavy pivoting gun mount attached directly to the reinforced armrest of his wheelchair. It was designed to cradle a massive .50-9 O-Sharps Buffalo rifle, absorbing the tremendous recoil that would otherwise knock him backward. Leora, too, evolved. She traded her morning dresses for heavy canvas trousers and sheepskin coats. In the freezing afternoons, Eric taught her how to shoot. He showed her how to account for the wind coming off the plains, how to steady her breathing, and how to fire the Winchester repeating rifle without flinching. "You don't aim at the man, Leora," Eric rumbled one afternoon, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he watched her sight down the barrel at a tin can 50 yards away. "You aim at the button on his coat. You aim at the silver buckle on his belt. Focus small, miss small." Leora squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, and the tin can spun violently into the snow. She lowered the rifle, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and looked at Eric. There was a profound, unspoken respect between them now. The marriage had begun as a cruel joke, a transactional mockery, but it had forged a partnership stronger than cast iron. "I am not leaving this land, Eric," Leora said quietly, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "Whatever Josiah Caldwell sends our way, we bury it here." Eric looked at her, his stormy grey eyes softening. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently resting over hers on the rifle stock. "Then we dig deep, Leora. The storm is coming." The storm arrived 3 days before Christmas. It was a blizzard of apocalyptic proportions, dumping 3 feet of snow in 48 hours and dropping visibility to 0. The wind tore the shingles from the roofs in Oakhaven and buried the cattle trails. In the midst of the whiteout, a solitary figure rode up to the Double H farmhouse. It was Sheriff John Gable. Gable was a pragmatic, tired man who had spent years turning a blind eye to the Caldwells' more aggressive business tactics in exchange for a peaceful town. He pounded on the heavy, reinforced door, half-frozen and desperate for shelter. Leora let him in, her Winchester hanging casually but deliberately at her side. Eric sat by the roaring hearth, his Sharps rifle resting in his lap, cleaning the mechanism with an oiled rag. Sheriff Gable shivered violently, holding his freezing hands to the fire. "Much obliged, Leora," he chattered. "My horse threw a shoe 2 miles back. I was coming to deliver a notice." He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a folded, rain-spotted legal document. "Josiah Caldwell is calling in the entirety of Elias's debt. He claims he found an addendum your late husband signed, payable in full, immediately, or the property is seized. I'm sorry, Leora. He sent me out before the storm hit to post the notice." Leora took the paper, her eyes scanning the forged signature. She didn't cry. She simply tossed the document directly into the roaring flames of the hearth. "Elias never signed such a thing, John. And you know it." Before Gable could respond, Eric suddenly raised his hand, his head tilting toward the boarded-up window. The wind was howling like a banshee, but the mountain man's ears had caught something else, a rhythmic, crunching sound, the snapping of frozen brush. "We have company," Eric said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling with deadly intent. "In this weather?" Gable asked, incredulous. "That's impossible. It's perfect cover," Leora replied grimly, jacking around into the chamber of her Winchester. "Josiah thinks the storm will hide the smoke if he burns us down." Outside, moving like phantoms through the blinding snow, Josiah Caldwell, Beauregard, and 8 heavily armed men were advancing on the property. They had wrapped their horses' hooves in burlap to muffle the sound and tied scarves over their faces. Josiah's plan was simple and utterly ruthless. Trap them in the house, torch the structure, and claim they perished in a tragic winter fire. The siege of the Double H had begun. Josiah Caldwell sat atop his black gelding, squinting through the driving snow. The farmhouse was a dark, silent silhouette against the whiteout. "Surround the perimeter," he shouted over the roaring wind. "Bo, take 3 men to the barn. Soak it in kerosene. The rest of you, cover the doors. If they run out, shoot them down." Beauregard, eager to avenge his previous humiliation, dismounted and trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the massive wooden doors of the barn, kerosene sloshing in the metal tin he carried. Inside the farmhouse, Eric strapped himself securely into his wheelchair. He looked at Leora and the stunned Sheriff Gable. "John," Eric commanded, "you're an officer of the law. You are witnessing an unprovoked attack with intent to murder. Are you going to hide, or are you going to earn your badge?" Gable looked at the forged eviction notice turning to ash in the fireplace, then at the blazing determination in Leora's eyes. The sheriff drew his Colt revolver. "I swore an oath, Eric. Let's send these bastards to hell." "Leora, cover the front. John, take the rear," Eric ordered, throwing a heavy buffalo robe over his shoulders. "I'm going to the barn." "Eric, you can't push through 3 feet of snow in that chair," Leora protested. "I don't need to," Eric replied, a grim, terrifying smile touching his lips. Weeks prior, anticipating a winter assault, Eric had dug a deep, narrow trench connecting the cellar of the farmhouse to the root cellar beneath the barn. He had roofed it with heavy timber and covered it with dirt. It was a hidden, subterranean artery. Eric rolled his chair to the cellar door, hoisted himself down the wooden ramp with his massive arms, and disappeared into the earth. Above ground, Beauregard reached the barn. He kicked the heavy doors, expecting them to be barred from the inside. Instead, they swung open effortlessly. He stepped inside, raising a lantern. The barn was eerily quiet. The cattle huddled nervously in their stalls. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath Beauregard's feet erupted. Eric burst from the root cellar trapdoor like a mythological beast. He didn't use his gun. His massive, calloused hand shot out in the darkness, seizing Beauregard by the front of his heavy winter coat. With a terrifying roar, Eric hauled the younger Caldwell off his feet, dragging him violently down into the subterranean trench. Beauregard's lantern shattered, plunging the barn into darkness, his panicked screams muffled by the earth. The 3 hired men with Beauregard froze in terror. Before they could react, Eric hauled himself up into the barn, pulling his heavily modified wheelchair up the ramp with explosive strength. He vaulted into the seat, strapped in, and swung the massive .50-90. Sharp's rifle around on its iron pivot. The boom of the buffalo rifle inside the enclosed barn was deafening, like a cannon firing. The half-inch lead slug tore through the heavy wooden doorframe, obliterating the lantern held by the closest hired gun and sending a shower of lethal wooden shrapnel into the men. They screamed, dropping their weapons and scrambling blindly out into the blizzard. The gunshot alerted Josiah and the men surrounding the farmhouse. "They're in the barn! Fire the house!" Josiah bellowed. 2 men charged the front porch with torches. From the narrow firing slits of the boarded-up windows, Leora's Winchester spat fire. Crack, crack. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot with Eric's training. One bullet shattered a man's collarbone. The other blew the heel off the second man's boot, sending him tumbling down the icy steps. Sheriff Gable laid down a suppressive volley from the back window, pinning down 3 more of Caldwell's men behind the water trough. Josiah, realizing his ambush had turned into a slaughter, spurred his horse toward the barn. Burn it all," he screamed at his remaining men. Eric rolled his chair to the open barn doors, a terrifying silhouette against the shadows. He pumped a lever action, ejecting the spent brass of the Sharps, and slid another massive cartridge into the breech. He aimed not at the men, but at the heavy, snow-laden branch of the ancient oak tree directly above Josiah Caldwell. Eric fired. The massive bullet severed the thick branch perfectly. With a deafening crack, 2 tons of oak and compacted snow plummeted downward, crashing directly onto Josiah and his horse. The gelding bucked in panic, throwing Josiah violently into the freezing mud before bolting into the whiteout. Josiah Caldwell, the ruthless king of Oakhaven, lay pinned in the snow, his left leg shattered by the falling timber. The remaining hired guns, seeing their employer crushed and bleeding, broke rank. They abandoned their weapons, mounted their horses, and fled blindly into the blizzard, leaving the Caldwells behind. The gunfire ceased. The only sound left was the howling wind. Leora and Sheriff Gable stepped cautiously out onto the porch, weapons raised. Eric rolled his chair out of the barn, the wide, iron-rimmed wheels crushing the snow beneath him. He dragged the bound, weeping form of Beauregard Caldwell behind him by a length of heavy rope. Eric stopped in front of Josiah, who was writhing in the snow, clutching his broken leg. The mountain man looked down at the mare, his stormy grey eyes devoid of any pity. "You brought fire and blood to my wife's door, Josiah." Eric's voice rumbled over the wind, cold and hard as the ice on the spring. "By all rights of the frontier, I should leave you here for the wolves." "Please," Josiah begged, his arrogance completely shattered. He coughed, spitting blood into the snow. "Please, Montgomery, I'll give you the deed. I'll forgive the debt. Just don't let me die out here." Sheriff Gable stepped forward, his badge catching the dim light. "You're going to do a lot more than that, Josiah. You're going to write a full confession. Extortion, forgery, attempted murder, and the poisoning of a water supply. And then you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life in the territorial prison." Josiah nodded frantically, weeping into the snow. When the spring thaw finally broke the grip of the Great White Death, the town of Oak Haven witnessed a sight they would talk about for generations. Down the muddy main street rolled a flatbed wagon, but this time it wasn't carrying a broken, defeated man, meant for a cruel joke. Driving the team of magnificent draft horses was Leora, radiant and resolute. Beside her sat Eric Montgomery. He was clean-shaven, wearing a fine woolen suit tailored perfectly by Abigail Preston to accommodate his massive shoulders. In the back of the wagon, bound in chains and escorted by Sheriff Gable, sat Josiah and Beauregard Caldwell. The townspeople poured out of the saloon, the mercantile, and the bank. They watched in awed silence as the widow and the mountain man delivered the corrupt titans of Oak Haven to the federal marshals waiting at the train station. With the Caldwell's empire dismantled, Leora's debts were officially declared fraudulent and erased. Thomas Pendleton, the corrupt assayer, fled the territory in the dead of night. The Double H Ranch was completely free and clear. Over the next 5 years, Leora and Eric turned the Double H into the most prosperous, respected cattle operation in the Montana Territory. Eric designed and patented a series of lever-operated farm implements that allowed him to work the fields directly from his chair, revolutionizing frontier agriculture for disabled veterans. He became a pillar of the community, the man people sought out for advice, for arbitration, and for protection. The man they had once laughed at was now fiercely guarded by the town. He was known universally as the pride of the plains. One warm evening in late July, as the golden hour painted the valley in hues of amber and violet, Eric and Leora sat on the front porch of their newly expanded home. The scent of sweetgrass and impending rain hung in the air. Leora leaned her head against Eric's massive shoulder, her hand resting over his. "Do you ever think about the day of the auction?" Leora asked softly, watching their vast herd grazing near the deep-water spring. Eric chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through his chest. He turned his head, kissing the top of her hair. "I think about the fact that I was dead, Leora, and you dragged me back into the light. Josiah Caldwell thought he was handing you a curse." Leora smiled, her eyes reflecting the endless Montana sky. "He handed me the greatest blessing of my life. He gave me my heart." Eric tightened his grip on her hand, looking out over the land they had bled for, fought for, and conquered together. The broken giant had found his strength, not in his legs, but in the love of the woman who refused to let him fall. Eric and Leora's breathtaking journey proves that true strength isn't about the physical hand you're dealt, but the unwavering courage with which you play it. They took the cruelest of jokes and forged it into an unstoppable, legendary frontier empire, showing that respect, ingenuity, and deep-rooted love can conquer any adversary. If you were inspired by this incredible tale of Wild West justice and unexpected romance, drop a like, share this story with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more thrilling, real-life stories from the untamed frontier.